to see the screens, and she can't hear well enough to actually hear what's going on. So we're going to send her a special presentation booklet with large type, and she can go through it at her own time to be able to understand what it is that we've done here in these last 3 days. So with that, I will introduce Daniel R. Brooks, a dear friend who I've known since 1980. And he's going to talk about his new book, one of his new books. Maybe he'll even include information on some of his other books. But this is a Darwinian survival guide. And I'll let Dan finish up his introduction and then move forward through the rest of the talk. So Dan, take it away. And I think you can use this. If you need to use a laser pointer, you can start there. Do you want it active? And do I just for moving? Yeah, so to get it moving, we do go here and then just use this. There we go. And you want laser? No, I'm fine. Okay. If you need this thing, it's here, but because that's if you have to do some wild
stuff. Well, thank you very much, Scott. Thanks to all you folks for coming to our third day of celebrating the 100th birthday of a truly remarkable pioneering woman of American science and international science. The 3 days each had a different theme that were 3 primary areas of focus and concern for Mary Lou for at least the 50 years that I've known her. And that was the importance of museum science in modern biology, climate change, biodiversity sorts of issues. The second was her interest in providing opportunities for women in science. And the third was her lifelong devotion to her home state of Nebraska. And instead of just telling a lot of old stories about the old times, we felt that in keeping with Mary Lou's own attitude towards life, that we would talk about moving forward rather than just making this a retrospective. So in talking about Nebraska then, rather than talking about how it was in the old days when we were wandering around doing field work there, we would talk about what's really of importance to the state of Nebraska today. Now, the good news is that the state of Nebraska is not alone in terms of concerns about climate change. The bad news is that the state of Nebraska is not immune from any of the potential impacts of climate change and the various threat multipliers associated with them. Now, I don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to do a shameless promo for this book, which is not very expensive and it's really pretty cool. I'm going to basically run through the major conclusions that Sal Augusta and I came to in the book. If you want to know how we came to draw those conclusions, you'll need to read the first 7 chapters of the book and not just the last 3. The jacket design was not ours. This was done by one of the artists at MIT Press. And the first time Sal saw it, he said, "Oh, that kind of has a Grateful Dead vibe." And in fact, there is a Grateful Dead song called "A Touch of Gray" that has a refrain that says, "We will get by, we will survive." So in fact, it's very apropos to the message that we are transmitting in this book. So what we want to, no, all right. So we have to do that, and then that. There we go. Okay. So in coping with the world today, we feel that it's very important for us to start focusing on effective action plans rather than lots of hand waving and lots of international conferences where everybody does photo ops and lots of celebrities show up and people yap a lot and nothing gets done. We have to begin focusing on getting something done. And in order to do that, the first thing we have to do is to what I call internalizing the, sorry, evidently.
Go ahead.
No.
I think you could do that.
I don't know. No.
I cannot see the screen from there. No, just stay there.
Go back.
Sorry. Tell me when I get close. There's something interrupting. Can you see it on your computer back there? Right, but I cannot see okay. No. Here, wait, I'll do this. There's something on the screen we can't see from here. And then we're gonna have to go back to this slide. Sorry.
Macintoshes are still much easier.
No, it's not. It's Zoom is the problem.
Zoom on Macintosh is still easier. All right. Now, in order to accomplish this, one of the things we say is that it's really important to what we call internalizing the pragmatics of complex systems. Now, we use this phraseology when we're talking to academics because then they think they know what we're talking about, or to policymakers because it sounds like words that they ought to understand and they don't, but they feel comfortable with it. Now, the reality is that this planet, this biosphere, the interaction between the planet and the biosphere is what is called technically a complex system. And there's a whole lot of science behind complex systems, but there's some fairly pragmatic kinds of outcomes that are important for everybody to know, even if they haven't spent a lot of time with their eyes crossing, listening to physics professors. So complex systems like the biosphere, like the planetary system, the climate, and the interaction between those, there are some features that are really important to understand. The first is that you cannot force them into a single optimal unchanging state. So any time somebody says, I have a plan for making the planet right, you can be certain that you don't have to pay any attention to them because they don't know what they're talking about. That's never going to happen. That's never been the nature of life. It's never been the nature of the climate on this planet. It's never been the nature of the interaction between life and the climate on this planet. The nature of that is change and coping with change. Moreover, we can guarantee that we will not be living in a world in which all change will occur gradually and incrementally. Now, every projection that comes out of the IUPC, the Paris Accords, that group that wastes a lot of money every couple of years, all of the models that they use are based on gradual incremental change. And they all know that those models are wrong. We all know, for example, that not only is the climate changing, but the rate at which the climate is changing is increasing. So models based on gradual incremental change, we know to be grossly incorrect, and we know that they give us a false sense of security. But we tell them anyway because we're trying to sell a false sense of security to the public. And finally, we have to understand that complex systems, when they do change, do not necessarily give warning signs that a major change is about to happen. And even if they do give warnings, advanced warning signs, those warning signs generally come too late to adapt to what's happening. So in biological systems, for example, when there's a major change in the environment, the species that go extinct are the ones that did not already have inherited capabilities that allowed them to cope with the new conditions. Okay? Biological evolution is not a process in which there's a major environmental change and magically all the species on the planet come up with a magical adaptation that allows them to survive. That's not what happens. You don't already have the capacity to survive before the change happens, you become a fossil. Which is what I think I had on some teaching evaluations later in my career, but that's a different issue. The other thing that we need to do is we need to cultivate detachment. And this is one of my favorite quotes from one of the great mystery writers, English mystery writers, Dorothy Sayers, who also was an advertising person. She was the person who came up with the advertising meme, sex sells, in addition to writing all these amazing mystery novels. And in this one novel, she wrote, detachment is a rare virtue and very few people find it lovable, either in themselves or in others. Now, detachment oftentimes is interpreted as a lack of empathy. So when I say, if we continue business as usual, by 2050, 50% of the human beings on this planet will be dead. And I just say it like that, people think, oh, what an unfeeling brute. That is an example of detachment. That doesn't mean I have no empathy. It means that I'm capable of drawing an inference based on evidence, regardless of my emotional commitment to it. Now, the only reason I say that to people is because I hope it's not true. And it's always a preface to, unless we change what we're doing. And then you hope that you're going to change. So the detachment is not the opposite of empathy, it's the opposite of teleology. Teleology is everything happens for a purpose, which basically leads you to a very fatalistic attitude. Well, whatever happens. And I hear people my age, I hear people say, well, I'm going to be dead before the bad stuff happens. It's not going to be my responsibility. I'm going to be dead. My kids will figure it out. I'm going to be dead. I don't care. That's the opposite of detachment. And that's not helpful. Detachment is essential if we're going to put aside our fears and get something done. And detachment in practice with respect to our book and the things that we talk about in the book is based on this old-fashioned battlefield medicine practice of triage. Basically, triage is you see a bunch of wounded people on the battlefield, you look at them and you say, these people don't need my attention right now. These people are already gone. I can't save them. These people need my attention right now. And that's one of the things that we need to look at and say, what's going on out there? What needs our help? What is beyond our help? In other words, what is it that no matter how much money we throw at it now, it's not going to make a difference? And how much of it is something that we can do something about right now? So this is part of being able to focus our attention on the things that we can actually do. This is effective action plans. So one of the things that we advocate is we stop talking about sustainability. Sustainability has come to mean, how can we continue to behave the way we're behaving and not suffer any consequences for it? How can we continue to have unlimited economic growth, but not have any penalties associated with unlimited economic growth? How can we keep polluting the environment, but not suffer the consequences for it? How can we keep, doing all these things we do that we know are contributing to the problems that we're having and not suffer the consequences for them? So sustainability is not now a discussion about how we can do things differently. It's about how we can continue to do things the same without suffering a penalty for it. Okay, now, if somebody tells you a story like that and they're trying to sell you a used car, you know not to buy that car, right? But that's the story of sustainability. Everybody who talks to you about sustainability is trying to sell you a used car that is in much worse condition than they want you to think it is. We need to talk about survival. We're past the point at which sustainability is going to help us. Effective action plans are not going to be based on sustainability. They're going to be based on survival, or at least survival first and sustainability second. Now, the good news is, from a biological perspective, is that we actually do have a theory of survival. And even better, there's only one of them. So you don't have to worry about a whole bunch of different alternatives. We actually have one theory of survival. It's called Darwinian evolution. And it is the only process that has allowed life to survive major environmental perturbations in the past, for the past 1.5 billion years. And it has never failed in the entire history of life on the planet. That's a pretty good track record. It's almost as good as the track record of the football team here when I was an undergraduate in the early 70s. We also need not just effective action, but effective action plans have to involve multiple participants. It has to involve a lot of different people. That's because the survival of technological humanity, ironically, is what we call a no technological solution problem. We have enough technology to take care of the problems. We have enough scientific knowledge to take care of the problems. What we don't have is the will to change our behavior. That's why sustainability feels so comfortable, because you don't have to change your behavior. You can keep doing what you've been doing. In order to cope effectively, in order to think about survival first, we have to change our behavior. But changing behavior is really difficult for human beings because there are three aspects of human psychology that are kind of built into our brains. The first is that human beings have a really strong need for drama. Crisis response is more emotionally satisfying than prevention. And we found that out, or we're continually finding that out in the area of emerging diseases. We also have a strong attraction to magic. And all the stories about how technology is going to save us, those are all magic stories. How many of them have come true in the last 50 years? None, because they're magic stories. And finally, human beings have a very strong aversion to bad news, especially if the bad news involves taking personal responsibility for the bad news. So these are three things that we have to accept. This is part of our nature. We have to accept this as the background against which we try to implement some effective change for survival. Now, our background is as evolutionary biologists. And so we're not saying this is what humanity should do. We're saying if you take an evolutionary perspective on this, here are the, with a sense of detachment, here are the implications. And if we talk about something we might call Darwinian social policy, that's based on what we call the 4 laws of biotics, which we have shamelessly ripped off from Isaac Asimov's 4 laws of robotics from his novels. And I'm not going to run through these. If you look at the online recording of this and you want to get it, it's also in the book available at Barnes & Noble. But I'm going to run through briefly about what the implications of these laws are. Now, the zeroth law is not called the first law. It's called the zeroth law because it's so fundamental that without this, none of the rest make any sense. And in pragmatic terms, the zeroth law of biotics means that war as a means of resolving conflicts and promoting peace has failed. Human beings started waging war with each other about 9,000 years ago, and we've never stopped. There are currently more than 60 wars ongoing on this planet. They are all failing to gain peace. They are all failing to resolve conflicts. They are all failing to promote economic or social progress. They're all failing to do anything about the climate threat multipliers that are not taking a vacation just because we're killing each other for no good reason at all. Humanity has war machines that are capable of destroying the entire planet. You do that, then the other laws of biotics are irrelevant, right? And in a globalized world today, the number of deaths outside combat zones now exceeds the number of deaths inside combat zones. The number of people starving to death in developing countries because they cannot get wheat from Ukraine is much greater than the number of Ukrainians and Russians that have killed each other off inside the conflict zone. That's the nature of a globalized world. So literally, war is a luxury that humanity can no longer afford. Now, we're not stupid. We're not naive. We know that just because a couple of tropical field biologists stand up and say, we can't afford to have war anymore, let's stop it. We know that's not going to make a difference. We're just saying, if you don't stop it, there are some very dire consequences on the near horizon. And so we advocate what we call a generalized MAD. MAD is an acronym for Mutual Assured Destruction. This was an acronym that emerged from a series of computer models that were done by the very best mathematicians in every country on the planet in the 1950s. And each of their governments got their best mathematicians together and said, come up with a way for us to win a nuclear war. How can we kill the Russians without killing ourselves? How can we kill the Chinese without killing ourselves? How can the Russians kill us without killing themselves? And in every single case, the mathematician said, it's not possible. That generated the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. And that's the reason there has been, up to this point in time, not even the threat of the use of nuclear weapons And we've now crossed that threshold. We now have world leaders threatening to use nuclear weapons in combat zones. And that's an indication of how dangerous we are, the situation we're in now. The first law implies that treating the world as what we call a material commons has failed. That is, conservation and biodiversity policies are all failing. They generate a lot of donor money, they spend a lot of money, and they get nothing done. The Endangered Species Act in the United States is sometimes likened to a Greek chorus where everybody stands up and counts the number of species that are going extinct. They've been extremely ineffective, and the reason for that is because we treat the biosphere as a marketplace. And there's cost and benefits, and this is good and this is bad, and with trade-offs and this sort of thing. When in fact, the biosphere is an evolutionary commons with an enormous amount of potential to cope with change by changing. Conservation biology advocates saving the biosphere by stopping all change, by stopping all evolutionary change. And interestingly enough, that attitude is echoed in political discourse in the United States by the Republican Party. So conservation biology is as conservative in its outlook as any Republican politician. They both believe that all change, whether it's social change or environmental change, will make things worse. And therefore, we need to stop all change now, and if possible, go back to the 1400s or 5,000 years ago or something, whenever they think that the world is better. And that's not the nature of the world. It's not possible, and that's not the way things operate. That's not the way the biosphere survives. The biosphere survives by coping with change, by changing, not by resisting change. The second law comes back to the issue of sustainability. Sustaining business as usual has failed. We are not making it, we are losing that battle. Technological humanity is susceptible to what's called the butterfly effect, which is a very small critical change in one aspect of the global economy, say a minor disease outbreak, can in fact crash the entire global economy if it's mismanaged properly, as we did with the COVID pandemic. So we managed to take a 100% preventable outbreak and massage it into a global pandemic that will never go away. That's why we have COVID recurring now. It's never going to go away. We managed to move it throughout the planet in circumstances where it will always be with us. That's an example of the butterfly effect. Now, conservation biologists believe that the biosphere is susceptible to the butterfly effect in the same way. But in fact, it's not true. The biosphere is not susceptible to the butterfly effect because of all of the evolutionary potential contained within it. It is a very robust system. But human society is very, very delicate and susceptible to the butterfly effect. And that's because we've tried to oversimplify the circumstances that we live in. Rather than thinking about treating the world as a common market, rather than thinking about trying to stop change in order to save ourselves, we need to understand that the only way we can actually save ourselves is to cope with the change that we know is coming and to anticipate future change based on what we know about similar events in the past and cope with those anticipated changes by changing, not by resisting them. We know that the economics of growth has failed. Now, this is, fair warning, Sal and I wrote this entire book, and we write a lot about economic systems in here. We never mention the word capitalism, and we never mention the word socialism in the book. That's because both of those theories of economics are flawed from an evolutionary standpoint because they're based on the assumption that unlimited growth is a solution, even though Charles Darwin showed us clearly in 1859 that unlimited growth is pathological. All economic systems based on maximizing growth, which is every economic system that has been proposed for the last 5,000 years, leads to trickle-down institutions of increasing inequality. Whether all the money goes to the state and then is supposed to trickle down, or whether it goes to a few corporations and then it's supposed to trickle down, doesn't matter. It doesn't trickle down. You end up with increasing inequality, and that's based on this fundamental anti-Darwinian view that growth is a solution rather than a problem, or at least unlimited growth. And the Darwinian replacement is what's called the economics of well-being, which is something I first learned about in talking with Hillary. That means that we're still allowed to have as much growth as possible, so long as the growth is not achieved by harming the well-being of others. And that means that during good times, we should be saving, and during bad times, we should be spending the surplus. This is what every politician tells us to do with our family economics, and there's not a single government that practices this. Every single government does exactly the opposite. So they make the whole thing worse. And we don't know it because we don't think they could possibly be that stupid. But in fact, they're not stupid, they're just greedy and undereducated. The third law says that, and this gets to our major preoccupation today, is that high density cities, that's overpopulated cities in climate insecure places have failed. And we say again, because high density cities in climate insecure places have never succeeded. That's one of the reasons that we have a discipline called archaeology. There are more abandoned cities than occupied cities on this planet. It never works. It has never worked. And we're now at a critical point where more than 50% of human beings on this planet, which means more than 4 billion people, live in high density urbanized centers in climate insecure places. Now, ask yourself how many post-apocalyptic films or novels portray human beings faced with a global crisis immediately running towards the cities for safety. No, none of them. It's because we actually have a sense, a common sense understanding that that's not the answer. In fact, we know at some level that that's the problem, or part of the problem. And the Darwinian replacement is what we call lower the lifeboats, which is get out of those cities. Create cooperating networks of low density communities in climate secure places. And when people tell me, but we've got no place to go. There's so many people on the planet. Look at all these people in New York City. There's no place for them to go. So that's not true. That's not true. They're all the places that those people came from. And if they've moved from here to there, what happened over here? So there, in fact, is low density space on this planet. And many of those low density spaces are in climate secure places. Institutions of social control, as opposed to what we call social stability, institutions of social control have failed. The social institutions arose in the earliest cities about 10,000 years ago, where cooperation was essential among people who spoke different languages, had different religions, were not familiar with each other and their customs, so they didn't know who to trust, but they had to get along in order to make the city work. And so the idea was that social institutions like institutionalized religion, institutionalized governance, institutionalized economic systems arose initially to help people cooperate with each other. The problem is that there was an unanticipated weakness in that idea. And that was that those institutions, because they ultimately would be managed by a small number of people, were vulnerable to being used by a small number of people to amplify their personal power. So this is a perfect example of a really good idea with unanticipated consequences that ended up working against us. So the Darwinian replacement for that is what we call institutions of social stability. And that is that all social institutions from the local level to whatever national, international level you might imagine have to be governed first by fiduciary principles. That is, They must bow to the wishes of the people they serve. That's the social institutions across the planet are faced with massive distrust. Nobody trusts their governmental institutions anymore. Nobody trusts the United Nations to be able to get anything done. Nobody trusts state government to do anything. Nobody trusts the federal government to do anything. And the reason for that is because they don't do anything. And it's not because they're not trying to do something, it's because they're locked into a system where they can't do anything, because they're locked into a system where they think they're supposed to produce one-size-fits-all policies, which they then impose. Instead of letting money trickle down, they have policy that trickles down. So how do you restore trust? You do something like this. A group of citizens go to some policy organization, say they're in a town in Nebraska, they go to the state and say, we want to do this. And some experts that have been hired to be policy people in that organization say, well, when I got my MBA at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, they said this would never work, so we're not going to fund you. Go away. Nothing happens. Nothing is tried. Trust is broken. The alternative that we advocate would be that the policymaker says, well, I don't think this is going to work, but you want to do it, so let's try it. There are only two possible outcomes. One is it works, in which case everybody has a party and the policy people have learned something and they now have an extra possibility to use in other situations. Or it doesn't work and the policy people say, okay, we tried it, it didn't work, we think this is why it didn't work, how about if we tried this? And at that point, the people are much more willing to trust you. So this is a way not only to allow new ideas to be tried out, but it's also a way to restore trust in institutions. Finally, population measures have failed. Now, we don't talk about this, is extremely a taboo right now to talk about overpopulation. And that's partly because there are a lot of problems associated with the way we talk about this. But we have to understand that uncontrolled population growth, like uncontrolled economic growth, is pathological in any biological system, including us. And the urge to consolidate, when you have a lot of people, the urge to consolidate into big cities, these are both very anti-Darwinian kinds of concepts. They sound like a good idea, but they're not really a good idea. And Darwinian principles show why those are not a good idea, because these things lead to natural selection. And natural selection is what we call a blunt instrument. Okay? If you have half the world's population in coastal cities at danger and there's a massive sea level rise and 50% of the human beings on the planet die overnight, that's natural selection. But that means that we've just lost an enormous number of people we would really like to save. The natural selection doesn't care. Natural selection, like I said, is a blunt instrument. Natural selection doesn't say, oh, this person's really bright, he gets saved. This person's a very talented musician, she gets saved. That's not how natural selection works. Natural selection says, you're in the danger zone for climate change, you're dead. Move on. Now, what we want to do is to tip the scales in our favor a little bit. And in order to do that, we have to understand what will happen if we don't do anything, and then try to mitigate that in our own favor. So what we need to do to regulate population growth is to do what every country on this planet that has achieved net zero population growth has done. There's only one feature that all the countries on this planet that have control of their population has instituted. Every one of those countries has access to education and access to economic opportunities for their women. When women have those opportunities, they regulate their reproductive output. Every country that's done that, that's been the case. every country that has out of control population growth has failed to allow 50% of its population to participate in the socioeconomic activities of the country. What we need is growth of settlements. Instead of saying, we've got a lot of people, let's just consolidate and make a bigger city. When a local community exceeds its carrying capacity, we can only support 30,000 people in this place. We now have 40,000 people. Instead of saying, let's try to build a 40,000 person city, say, let's take 10,000 people who'd like to be pioneers and let's let them set up a new community, and we'll retain a cooperating tie with them. So instead of making bigger and bigger and bigger cities, make bigger and bigger and bigger networks of connected, cooperating, small, survivable operations. Now, what we believe is true from the standpoint of evolutionary biology is that humanity is heading for a fall. Quickly. The time is short, the danger is great, and we are largely unprepared. We can either alter our behavior now at enormous cost, which we call falling to our knees, and leading to a bottleneck and rebound effect. Or we can fail to alter our behavior, continue with business as usual, and then sometime around 2050, the projections are that we will fall on our faces. We will be facing a collapse and the need to rebuild. Now, the interesting thing is that Darwinian principles will help us in either case. So even if there is a general collapse and there are only some human beings left, there's enough potential to rebuild. That's what evolutionary history tells us. Mass extinctions in which 90% of the biodiversity on the planet goes away is followed by the evolution of a new biosphere. This has always happened. So there's always hope. We can survive, as the Grateful Dead said. There's time to act without panic. Okay, we say, oh, we've only got 30 years. Yeah, okay, we've got 30 years. There's time to act without panic. We don't have to come up with a perfect utopian plan forever and ever by 2050. We just have to come up with a plan to survive what we anticipate will be the conditions in 2050. Get to 2050, avoid the major collapse, and then we'll deal with the rest of it. We can even thrive during this time. The conditions or the protocol for judging any kind of policy proposals associated with climate change going forward should follow this sequence. Does the proposal contravene any of the 4 laws? If not, then continue to consider it. Does it enhance survival and well-being? If yes, then continue to consider it. Can it be improved without violating the 4 laws? If yes, then modify it. And this still will leave an enormous room for individual human creativity, because none of these first 3 require us to believe that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to this, because there isn't. If there are 5,000 communities that want to do something, there are 5,000 different ways to achieve a positive outcome. But you have to be able to engage the creativity, the human creativity, to produce effective action plans. And this is what we call the third way, a detached view of the future. Not a utopia, which we consider to be unattainable, and not apocalypse, which we consider to be unacceptable. But something in the middle that involves survival and hope, something that's messy, something that's highly individualistic, something that constantly has to be watched and monitored and tinkered with, but something that has a 4 billion year history of success. And that's why we wrote it. Thank you very much. get her.
technical stuff that you could introduce.
Okay.
as they come
All
up.
right.
So I'm gonna go ahead and start moving this around. Any questions first for Dan and comments?
Yeah. I talk to anybody who wants to talk about it. And I say, I have no ultimate answers, but I have some experience and some insight. As do you. Let's talk together and let's see what bubbles up to the surface. Okay? I'm not going to say, I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and someone living in Minden, Nebraska needs to do what we're doing in Asheville. Okay. No, I happen to live in Asheville. Tell me what's going on in the world. What are the problems in your house? What are you going to do? How do you think you can do that? If anything sounds like something I've got some experience with, I might offer some comments. But at the end of the day, if there's any way I can help you, try to fulfill the aspiration. Then I'm there at the very least, I'm there as a cheerleader on the side. If there's something that you say that sounds to me like, I'm not sure that's going to work, I won't say don't do it. I'll say, well, this has been tried in other places, it didn't quite work for the following reason, but in your situation, it was different. The big problem is you don't even know that because you haven't actually experienced this kind of approach. And so it's a question of talking to as many people as possible and saying, if anything I say sounds interesting, think about it. And if it can apply to your particular situation, that's great. That justifies all the money that society pays to the university. Yes, sir. There is an old document, it's so old that it was called the UN Charter of the Rights of Man. Right? And now the Charter of the Rights of Humanity. But at any rate, the aspiration that I'm making is to make sure that all human beings have food, water, clean water, shelter, and that's great. Now, if there is something like a major emergency, human beings are going to gravitate towards places with water, food, shelter, and that's actually, this is a really good introduction to our next speaker. So, yeah. Well, let me answer quickly the second question, which is Hillary's Hillary's much closer to the policy end of this than I am. I know that's a little bit of a kludge. It's her responsibility now. The other is that we continue to try to engage with policymakers. In the early autumn of 2019, a group of us knew, as a result of emails from colleagues in China, that something was happening in Wuhan that sounded like talk. And we knew when I was here in September of 2019, we knew that if we didn't stop international air traffic then, that there was a high risk of a global pandemic. We could not get the World Health Organization or European CDC or any national public health organization to take that seriously. And we haven't learned anything, not a single public health organization. has changed any policy as a result of it. We know it's worked. I have offered to pay my own way to Geneva to talk to World Health Organization. They are not interested. So we can't hear you again if you're away from the mic. Sorry. I forget what I just said. Anyway, we do our best. We keep trying. But you have to understand, that's one of the reasons that we came to the conclusion that we needed, the focus had to be at the grassroots, because this heavily top-down organization, policy organization that we've created for ourselves is not working. And it's virtually, as the gentleman here mentioned, it's virtually impossible for that kind of structure to be open to any kind of change. They will simply want to do more and more and more of what they've already been doing. So you constantly hear, NIH says, just give us more money to keep doing what we've been doing, and eventually it will work. There's never any, maybe we're on the wrong track here. And so, to be quite honest with you, if someone in the World Health Organization called me up and said, come to Geneva and talk to us, I would do that. But I'm no longer trying to get them to do that. I'm talking to local people. Because I think ultimately, especially if we're talking about survival, that's where it's going to happen. That's not necessarily a very happy answer, but that's where we are at this point.
Any questions? Did you answer questions on the internet?
I didn't.
Just get it on the mic.
I don't see anything.
Just say, are there any questions from you?
Gabor is going to. Yeah, right. Sorry, that was my fault. My apology. Yeah. Okay. So, but Hillary will remember that. I didn't. We all know that men wear out faster than women, so that's a problem. So. Well, let's get Hillary up. So the next speaker, Hillary Brown, is an accomplished architect and one of the first person I heard speak about circular economies, climate migration, rural revitalization, and the notion that people interested in rural revitalization, that people interested in climate migration might actually want to make some common cause as part of effective action plans. And I joke a little bit, but it's actually, there's more truth than not in saying that Hillary's work is primarily responsible for much of the final 3 chapters of our book. So from that, we'll let Hillary take over.
Well, Dan is a really tough act to follow, but I've been following the act, and I've been following. Okay.
Yeah, so come on.
I've been following Dan's advice, and he's been very generous in encouraging my looking into some of the possibilities that I'll be talking about. So thanks. Thank you, Dan. I'm especially grateful to participate today, and my appreciation also goes to the Manor Lab for hosting me, and for Bruce and Barb for hosting us. And give me a second here.
Yeah, we just have to do this sharing thing again.
Okay, so my first visit to the state, and I was all prepared for a road trip to see some small towns, Broken Bow, Red Cloud, and I sadly had to scrub that because I wasn't up to the heat. So I'm glad I'm here participating in this, and I hope to give you a kind of broad overview of some of the things that we're talking about in terms of climate migration and how it is connected, in my view and Dan's view, to rural revitalization.
Sorry, I had problems with the
I can't get it, Gabor. It
Do-
should be there, but
Yeah.
it's not working.
Oh,
So I will kill this. And I will restart Zoom. Which is here. Not coming out. Oh, we have to go up here. And go, yeah, it's,
complicated.
I know. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That should be it. Are we sharing? Yeah, share. Sharing. Great. Okay. Go ahead. We have actually 10 minutes before you're actually supposed to start.
Oh, okay. I'll run down again.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Right. Right, tried that, it doesn't work. Oh, now it is. I'm gonna share that. Got it?
Yes.
Good, you get rid of that.
And I am going back here
Okay, that's it.
and then testing, and
Yeah.
that might be the mouse or even.
I'm gonna try
This.
the arrow. Yeah, the
The
arrow.
arrows ones. Yeah, got it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Hillary Brown will now.
Hillary Brown will now take over for her part of the talk. And if anybody has questions in the internet, or if they can't hear us when we're talking, please just make a comment and we will address that comment as best we can. I think we're going to have a lot of people coming in, so.
Good. Alrighty. Well, thanks again, everybody. I'm going to talk about how we might be starting to think about revitalizing small town America, at the same time preparing for all things climate change. And I say that from the perspective that we have all these threat multipliers, as Dan mentioned, from continuing planetary heating. So I think it's time to talk about the likely population shifts that may be occurring in the US. And that's what I'll try to cover with a little emphasis on Nebraska. So in the decades to come, many of the climate displaced, the migrants, may opt for small cities and towns in climate safe areas, which I'll talk about, rather than settling in more crowded and stressed urban areas. And there's lots of reasons for that I'll talk to. I'm going to talk to some projections for where resettlement might occur. And I'm going to emphasize how revitalized, resilient, and willing small hometowns may be able to receive climate migrants. And at the same time, we can talk about restoring the population and the economy in order to welcome some future climate migrants. And I'm also going to talk about some possible pathways. So why be bringing newcomers to small town America? Well, I don't think I need to tell you that from 2010 here to 2019, 90% of rural counties lost key working age population, and some more than 10%. And that's on top, of course, of decades of out-migration to cities. Today, only a very small percentage of rural Americans work in agriculture, and with the majority working in services and industry. And there, rural employment has really never recovered from the 2008 recession. So to this, public policy has really responded rather tepidly to the plight of small town USA. And compared to the levels of public investment in urban centers, the small towns that have lost population and resource wealth receive significantly less aid. And moreover, as you can see on the right, the aid delivery mechanisms are fraught with complexity. They're spread across 400 federal programs. So imagine, being a small town manager and having to, manage this thicket of grantsmanship. So at the same time, rural lending is declined as banks are closing, and they're closing branches and they're reducing credit in rural America. So to climate disturbances. Recent predictions put, as Dan has said, millions of Americans directly at risk from sea level rise from now to the end of the century and beyond, clearly. More than half of America resides within 50 miles of the coast. And these are the zones that are most vulnerable, not only to sea level rise, but to flooding from hurricanes. So even the most optimistic projections of sea level rise of, say, a meter by 2100 would put 4 million people at risk, whereas something like 1.8 meters of sea level rise will render 13 million at risk. And these figures don't include the millions in inland riverine areas that are flooding, like the upper Midwest, or the 53 million people in the overheated Southwest, and especially racial and ethnic minorities there, and then the 12 million others in the Northwest that are considered climate socially vulnerable to wildfires. So that's the context. So here's something kind of amazing, not very happy. Americans, according to recent studies, Americans have been relocating from the blue places that lie in harm's way to the red. And for example, in 2020, some 16 million homes were constructed in the West in fire-prone areas where there's shrublands and grasslands. So we also know that, I don't know, can you see my mouse? No, let me get the laser pointer, just a second. We also know, I got it. Florida's population has soared by nearly 500,000 in 2022, despite the fact that 90% of people believe climate change is real, and almost half of those people have felt the negative impacts of flooding. And then, of course, there's Phoenix, which is it remains America's largest growing city. And despite the fact that in 2023, there was something like 31 days of temperature exceeding 110. So why move there? So what seems to be driving these relocations? And one thing is the so-called natural amenity migration, which is moving to high value natural areas and recreation areas. They're amenities for now, but they're going to be imperiled at some point. Also, these places are really more attractive because they're pro-business, lower housing costs, lower taxes, fewer regulatory burdens. So that is the picture of what's happening. And this is on top of what we've seen as out-migration from the Midwest. Now, to better understand, I think, the coming population dispersion, this map illustrates the national scope of movement of people post-Hurricane Katrina. Some 800,000 people spread across the country, many stayed close to home. And as we know, hurricanes are becoming more frequent and intense. So that's something to keep in mind about the rate of dispersion. Now, here is a projection, simulation undertaken for 2100. And again, people moving away from the blue areas on the coast and moving towards the red and darker red areas. And this was based on the population movement data from the hurricanes against sea level rise projections. And then they used a machine learning model to predict where by 2100 coastal populations are most likely to move. And you can probably see, well, I'll list the most major urban centers like Dallas, Austin, Tampa, Orlando. And when people move there, they're going to drive up housing costs. They're going to create conflict around employment opportunities, and they're going to force out many people of lower income in a process known as climate migration. So to this issue of where, it might be more sensible to think about moving. Now, this is one projection. It's shown here in blue are what one organization considered the climate favorable counties based on risk factors, and you can see in orange the research foundations that made some of these projections. And you'll see it's the northern Midwest, the Great Lakes, parts of New England, and to an extent Appalachia. And to an extent, the blue, green, and green areas are going to be relatively more safe, but not as safe as the blue. Now, this map was made by an organization called Place Initiative that was based on, as I said, this kind of meta-analysis of risk data supplied by others. So again, the blue areas have low climate risk. The white areas are the highest risk. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at Nebraska. Okay, so in the east and the northeast, these are some of the areas that they project may be easier for populations. But if you look to the risk factors towards 2100 on the left, you can see more hot days, longer duration, decreased soil moisture, and even heavy precipitation and flooding. So that's just a kind of little projection, and we'll move on from there. Now, at the same time, let's look at some of the positive opportunities that may arise in these areas that might help counter climate risk from a resiliency perspective. I talk resiliency, not sustainability. Something called the Princeton Net Zero Energy Report indicates these areas in dark blue that are considered potential locations for hosting good renewable energy, enabling us as a nation to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in the red, these are areas of potential solar, and you can see the southeast and the, we'll zoom into Nebraska here. So I'm showing the overlap here between the blue-green receiver areas and promising renewable energy coverage. Again, this is very loose projections. So you can see Eastern is a great area for optimizing utility scale wind, and the southeast corner is favorable for solar farming. Now, there's inevitable resistance to this kind of occupation by technology, but we shouldn't dismiss the economic boost that solar and wind are going to bring to these areas. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, there are other resource opportunities that exist. We have in the receiving areas also coincide with these so-called opportunity zones in pink. Now, these are typically economically distressed communities that have been lacking investment for decades, and they've been nominated by the state's governor, and they are eligible to receive preferential tax treatment to spur both public and private investment. So let's do a kind of overlay of all of this. Okay, and we're overlaying these several resource opportunities. And the key receiver counties are sketched in with these black outlines. And you can see, again, especially good wind in central Midwest, Texas and Iowa, solar in southeast parts of New England, and all three resources occurring along the Appalachian spine. Now, if we zoom in, again, I've sketched in the receiver, potential receiver areas, and you can see solar and wind, and you can see the opportunity zone. And I don't know, I'm guessing this is in Garfield or Loop County, so I don't know anything more about it, but there are lots of pink little dots along the Platte River. Now, to what might be some of the challenges of having newcomers enter these areas, and what's the challenge for assimilation? And what we're looking at here are locales of extremism, racism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. And these are produced by the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in yellow, those are the location of hate groups, and the red dots indicate the sites of white supremacist propaganda production. So good news for Nebraska, relatively few propaganda sites and only 4 hate group sites. And that's low in comparison with other Midwestern and Western states. And as you can see, you know, there's a profusion in the East Coast. So that's a piece of useful news. Now, those sites notwithstanding, this map reveals a growing rural population diversity. And in gold, it's 3 percentage points or more in the last decade. And this kind of is in contradiction to the notion of the great white monolith. We're seeing by 2020, 2/3 of rural counties consisted of at least 10% people of color, suggesting perhaps that there's more potential for receptivity of diverse incoming populations. And again, I'm talking about climate migrants that are, I'm mostly emphasizing internal climate migrants from within the states moving away from harm, but also that includes other assimilation of other migrants. So here in Nebraska, you can see the diversity growth of more than 3% across the state. And that's similar to what's been happening, and I've been reading about what's been happening in farming communities in Northwest Iowa, which are encouraging Latino populations to come in to fill the jobs. Now, what are some other concerns? The receiving counties, again, are sketched in black, and they're overlaid on a map that was produced by the Nature Conservancy. And it shows in these shades of green, more resilient, ecologically resilient sites, suggesting those are prime for conservation. At the same time, they're more resilient and they're good for population. So in a way, this is, and from a biodiversity perspective. So the map really reveals receiver areas where there may be some potential conflict between the ecological, the imperatives for ecological resiliency and conservation and population expansion. So just something to keep in mind. For example, there's Western Wisconsin, You can see Eastern Michigan, upstate New York, and northern New England. And this really indicates the need for careful land use planning in the decades ahead. I couldn't really make this out for Nebraska, but this roughly reveals, you can see in dark green, I assume that that is the Sand Hills. And the one area that seems to overlap is perhaps in Boyd or Knox counties. And so again, these areas that are designated as receiving areas suggest the need for more incentives for controlled development. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but from the research of others and myself, I've listed a range of desirable attributes for potential receiver towns. Places of low climate risk, more diverse demographics, what we might call smart governance, and towns with economic redevelopment prowess, good potential. And at the bottom of the screen, and you could probably get a copy of this slide, I'm including the reference to Place Initiatives analysis. They actually went through and analyzed and identified some 256 small towns and 160 small cities that meet many of these criteria. So, you know, we're beginning to formulate potential for this. Again, this is only one assessment, and there will be, no doubt, many others. Now here, I wanted to encourage those of you thinking about small town revitalization to look at some examples of where this has happened successfully and in climate receiver counties. So on the upper left, these towns have been resourceful in terms of economic redevelopment, creating new housing and good transportation solutions. And you're familiar, many of you probably, with the Nebraska town of Ord. How many know about Ord? Yeah. Okay, so that's a success story based on countering economic decline at the beginning of the century by adopting a 1% tax increase to go towards redevelopment. They developed a business leadership academy, and they've even undertaken a new housing. They even have a housing authority for affordable housing, and they installed broadband internet. And in the decades since, there's been roughly a 54% increase in young families. So it's kind of a model to be looking at. It's a population of 2,100, something like that. Also, there's Clinton, Iowa, which had a dilapidated Main Street and industrial corridor that straddled the historic Lincoln Highway. And DOT funding allowed them to reroute that highway, and so the town could restore its Main Street and add green infrastructure and bike lanes and all those good things, and turn the outlying brownfields from the no longer industrial area into mixed-use housing. So that's a good news story. Let's see. Now to the towns below. The town of Gorham, New Hampshire, worked with the U.S. Forest Service to add about 2,600 acres of what became community-owned forests, generating revenue for the town from sustainable timber harvesting. The tiny town of Gwinnett, Montana, which, like parts of western Nebraska, sit near once vast native prairie. They worked with the World Wildlife Foundation and other NGOs to actively return cropland to grasslands, to eradicate invasive species, reduce conifer intrusions, and they installed wildlife friendly fencing to enable animals to move. Okay, now to some other areas. So what about utilities? What about infrastructure? So there are rural places that have been ambitiously undertaking what we could call regenerative infrastructure improvements. Water-strapped Cloudcroft, New Mexico, small town, always overwhelmed with summer tourists. It upgraded its wastewater system so that they could literally reuse the water by filtering it, disinfecting it, and then blending it with natural sources. And so they were able to meet the new demand. There's a town called Janesville in Wisconsin, which combines its sewerage biosolids with food waste, and that produces, it amplifies the biomethane production, which can then be treated and used to fuel heavy vehicles of the town, and that eliminates diesel fuel use. So that's a really exemplary opportunity. Then there's the tiny, let's see, the tiny Rockport town of Missouri near, oh, wait a second. Yeah, so to energy autonomy and broadening broadband. Rockport, Missouri, near the Nebraska border, teamed with the John Deere Company, which is apparently getting in the wind business. And their turbines supply 125% of the town's electrical demand, and that eliminates the transmission charges, and they're able to sell the excess to the grid. So these are just, some examples. And then I like this one because Morris, Minnesota, shades its grazing dairy cows under raised photovoltaic arrays. This is a really great practice. Sheep, dairy cows, you can also grow useful crops under PV arrays. So it's dual use. And that, and this protects the animals during hot spells. And then there are some energy dependent data centers like the one in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which located itself near the wastewater treatment plant, used that biogas to power the data center. So they took the biomethane, they compressed it, and they used it to generate the power, electricity for the data center. And then finally, there's Oskaloosa, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Oskaloosa, erecting energy efficient lighting poles throughout the town. But then they thought, we can use those poles to carry high-speed internet. So they supplied the town. So these are just a handful of examples. And what I want to say in particular is, these are kind of one-off improvements, regenerative improvements, but we don't really look at them collectively and how they may compound to produce additional benefits. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next. If you can suspend your disbelief a little bit here, I'm going to talk about integrated circular systems, which are closed loop frameworks. Now this on the left is a kind of composite hypothetical, but what it does is it looks at the opportunity on how nature arranges its economic arrangements of a forest ecosystem with the exchange of energy and waste production in a closed loop cycle. So what I was going to say, just as one example, the wastewater treatment plant can surrender its biosolids that can become compost or digestate. And by the way, they can use the excess after composting for animal stalls. And then the effluent coming out of the wastewater treatment plant contains nutrients that can be diverted to agriculture or even something called controlled environment, agriculture, which we can maybe speak about later, agroforestry. And then from those forests, the waste biomass can go to a biomass energy plant. So you get the idea that there's reciprocities and synergies across these systems. And we don't look at these. We never, engineers don't plan this way. So there's opportunity that lies in there. I mean, we're not going to have a town do all of these hookups and exchanges, but it can greatly reduce pollution. It helps husband water resources and fertilizes crops and generates energy. So just in terms of how practical this is, I've just listed the names of small communities that I've found that have done exactly these improvements. And some of them are like under 1,000 people. And then some of them are small cities that have hosted some of these exchange practices. So that should be encouragement to be thinking more broadly and more circularly. So when we talk about the circular economy, this is one example of how we can arrange our utilities, our agriculture, some of our commerce to be in sync with each other and to yield greater than the sum of the parts. Okay, so I'm about to close. So I'm going to read the quote, which kind of recaps the message. In the 21st century, we must shift from coastal to inland, from low to high elevation, from resource depleted to resource rich areas, and we must do so, I'm not going to say sustainably, I'm going to say resiliently, so that our next habitat may well be our last chance to coexist with nature before there's nothing left to sustain us. So again, I just wanted to use that to summarize my points. In other words, we should avoid migration to at-risk and resource-depleted areas that I talked about in the beginning. We should be sustainably leveraging local assets, including natural, financial, and social capital in prospective resettlement areas. And then we should carefully and indeed more densely plan how we accommodate newcomers in our towns to avoid depleting ecologically sensitive areas. And finally, we need to take real proactive measures to reduce or eliminate the potential social and cultural conflicts that might appear. So I'm going to close with this, and maybe the last slide, I will do something that Dan did, which is to post a publication, which I hope to bring out sometime this fall. And again, it's on this topic of how do we bring these two things together, small town revitalization, preparing for being receiving communities for climate migrants from everywhere. So, questions? And I hope that begins to answer one of your initial questions. Okay. Yeah. Why is that? Well, I asked the makers of the map that same question. Okay.
The question was?
Yeah, why did they sidestep in the map some of the areas of Nebraska, most of Nebraska? And I was alarmed when I saw this initially. And they said, well, the areas in green, and there are more areas in green than I really showed, are kind of, you know, they're more resilient, or not the most resilient. But clearly on that map, I don't know if I can go back to it, there are basically at-risk areas, a lot in the southeast, and I think, yeah, mostly in the south. Again, this is only one analysis It's one of the first few that I've seen that's trying to identify these climate favorable areas. But how you define that, what the boundaries are, and what the criteria are open for discussion. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, the question was, does that have something to do with the attributes in those areas? That's a very good question, because when I listed all those criteria, a lot of them evaluated, capacity to do redevelopment, or potential for densification, or just pure economic health of these areas. So I think rightly you've suggested that they have a kind of sieve that may have caused many of those areas to fall out. So do not take this as the last word. And I just wanted to have some vehicle to hang the discussion on. Yes.
Yeah, maybe to follow up on that question. Your material you were looking at, talking about water, but doing more or less recycling and all that.
Yeah.
And it happens that Nebraska really is over 2/3 of the whole 9.5.
Yeah.
The richest water resource in the country. Now we're messing it up.
Yes.
And it seems like maybe some of the resources
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I listed in my criteria great hydrology. But as you're suggesting, and we all know that Ogallala is being rapidly depleted. It may even be disappearing from parts of the sandhills, drying up, I don't know. And then the dispersion of rainfall is really highly uneven in Nebraska, right? I mean, you have flooding in the northeast quadrant. So I don't know if that answers the question about hydrology adequately. Yes.
So I really have to counter what you just said, because the depletion of the Ogallala aquifer is primarily in Texas.
Yes.
Yeah. In Nebraska, we have areas that are depleted 50 to 100 feet in a 300-foot saturated thickness. But those are relatively rare. If you look at a water table map over the last century, there are many parts of the Nebraska, of the Ogallala aquifer in Nebraska that is actually. So I think Bruce is right. We've done a pretty fair job of maintaining the aquifer. We have some emerging issues with water nitrates, groundwater nitrates, that we need to really pay attention to. I think this is a huge asset for Nebraska.
Yes. No, good. Thank you for that information. So the discussion really just touched on Nebraska has an unusually promising potential for water resources. And I stand corrected on that. But, I think that as Texas and the other states start to deplete it, I mean, it's going to be affecting your available water at some point too. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 What an excellent question. So what is an optimal size for a climate resilient community? And I think it touches a little bit on what Dan had to say. We're learning more and more about the benefits of local economy, proximity to food production, water availability. And as I showed that Nature Conservancy image about ecological resiliency, that is something that we really have to pay attention to. So, as we spread out, we are remote from water, we're remote from food. As we become a big city, our carbon consumptions go up because our consumption level go up in big cities. So I guess what Dan has advocated and what I think I've been encouraged to as well to think about, and this is counter to most urban planners thinking. They say cities are sustainable, everybody should move to cities. I don't think that's the answer. I think that we have to have both and. I think that the big cities are going to have more trouble than the small locations, again, depending on where they are. So if you want an optimal size, I'm not really equipped. I'm not a geographer, but I would say around about 10, 20,000. Even 5,000 is a viable town size. You want to add anything to that? And in particular, I just want to add the comment about it's not each town on its own. It's a network of towns, and differentiating economies across this network will simulate the agglomeration of a city without the density of the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is that's an issue that needs to be talked about a lot. Ultimately, I think there is no optimal size. This is a one-size-fits-all solution kind of thinking. It's going to depend on the local circumstances. And as Hillary said, what we're looking at is think more in terms of what is the minimum number you need to make it work, and then scale it up to the point that it's now too big to work and then butt it off. And in some cases that may be, it may only take 5,000 people to make something happen that's worthwhile, that not only sustains the local people, but also provides benefits for cooperating communities. So it's more a question of finding out, each local place has to do what Hillary calls make an inventory. So a local town says, we would like to get bigger. We would like to have more people. We would like to have this, and this. And here are our assets. We're close to water. It's easy to get water here and it's pretty abundant, as opposed to, well, water's a little iffy. Those are going to be two different assessments of your assets. So you do an inventory of what you've got and what you want to do. That combined then generates a calculation of what biologists call the carrying capacity. So that tells you what you think the maximum survivable number of people in your town would be. If you're successful, that town will grow beyond that number. And then you have two choices. You can either go down the rabbit hole of creating bigger and bigger cities that become less and less survivable, or you take the overflow and you say, those of you who'd like to go start a new town, let us help you go start a new town, and we'll maintain a cooperative connection with you. So in some cases, you may find that in particular circumstances, 5,000 to 10,000 may be the maximum. In other places, it could be 30,000 to 50,000. It's just going to depend on what the local resources are and what the planning can be for how those can be used to generate a figure for the local carrying capacity. But this is going to be the opposite of one size fits all. It's going to be a different number for every place. And that number is partly going to involve what the resources are, but it's also going to involve the creativity of the people who are there. What can we do with this? What would we like to do? And what kinds of people would we like to attract here?
just going to anecdotally say that there's already an experiment. Some new town in California, in the Bakersfield area, I don't know. It's a spin-off from Silicon Valley. It's a high-end investment. We're going to have 10,000 people here. And we're going to really plan it well. We're going to have walkable streets. People will not need their cars, blah, blah, blah. And where do they put it? They put it in a water impoverished area, right? So we have to be strategic if we want to, experiment with new towns. I think that, there are going to be new towns. I really do think that as new industries pop up in different, and there's a lot of talk about bringing, silicon-based industries into the Midwest. And so there's going to be the need for bringing smart young people and housing them. And so, some may choose to live in, legacy cities, small legacy cities, but others will say, I like a rural lifestyle and let me, choose some place within commuting distance. So yeah, it's up for grabs. But we need to be thinking ahead. I think that's the only message I want to close. Yeah, please.
Yeah, one last thing occurred to me is this. There may very well be, so we think in terms of the idea being that a cooperating network of smaller, survivable, resilient communities can emulate the benefits of a much larger urban setting without the cost of all that crowding together. So one of the things that Hillary and I have talked about is, well, if we're going to do this, I may live in a town and I may need to drive for an hour to get to the next town where there's a symphony orchestra because my town's not big enough to have one. And then I asked Hillary, I said, well, you live on Long Island. If you want to go listen, you want to go to a Broadway play, how long is it going to take you to get in there? And so we have to realize that, in fact, if it takes you an hour to drive on a nice open road as opposed to 2 hours in the subway, in fact, you're really not losing as many benefits as people think. The supposed unique benefits of big, huge, crowded cities. Not necessarily true. But it's also going to be true that none of those small towns individually, there are going to be some things that are going to have to be group supported operations. For example, a town of 5,000, a town of 10,000 is not going to be able to support a major medical facility. What you're going to need to do is to put a major medical facility plunk down in the middle of where those towns are. And if there's a space that's not occupied by the towns, it's because that's a place which would not be considered to have a lot of resources for making an ongoing circular economy. In other words, what I'm leading up to is the idea that some food deserts may actually be really important. Okay, so places like Lincoln, for example, you have a major center of training and learning. You have major health facilities. You have things that require a group effort. These smaller communities are not going to be able to support something big. In where I live in Asheville, North Carolina, there is basically, Asheville is a town that's gone from 70,000 to 150,000 people in the last 10 years. There are, within a 50-mile radius, there are probably 100 small towns, many of which are trying to revitalize themselves in one way or another. But all of them are connected to two major medical centers, hospitals and health centers in Asheville. And none of those towns could maintain those centers by themselves. So it's going to require a lot of individual local thinking and then cooperative thinking among those local groups. But it's still basically going to be a bottom-up kind of operation. The initiative is going to come from local people saying, this is what we need, this is what we can do, this is what we need help with. And we'll look to our neighbors for that.
You talked about in larger towns, that a lot of things, if you have catastrophes, like when you break down, like internet and things like that, things that we depend on, and you haven't mentioned that at all. Am I remembering that right or not?
Well, yeah, the question is about the potential for, if the worst case scenario happens and we have large scale social and socioeconomic collapses, large scale manufacturing centers collapse, the internet collapses, this sort of thing. Those kinds of things are going to disproportionately affect people in the most heavily populated, the most densely populated areas. One of the things that more and more people should begin thinking about is not something like how do we preserve the large-scale automobile manufacturing centers? If there's a major catastrophe, they're gone. We should be thinking in terms of what is the smallest factory that could produce enough cars for a particular set of communities? What's the smallest size factory we would need to produce enough solar panels to maintain a solar farm in our community to generate enough electricity for our community? And again, this is sort of a bottom-up thing. It's what do we need then versus what can we scale up? So one of the ideas is, again, if there is a worst case scenario, the idea is to maintain as much of as many elements of the positive aspects of technological humanity now as possible in small scale local areas, recognizing that as we recover, we can scale these things up. In other words, we can always, if we ever get back to the point where things are good, we can always make bigger, we can make bigger factories for making more Teslas or whatever. But if we're talking about how to survive in the face of increasingly difficult times, we need to think more in terms of what do we need and what's the minimum amount of infrastructure that we need to make that available. And so, I would be, if I were thinking about this, I would be talking to a lot of, 15 to 25-year-olds about could you create a local internet so that even if the whole satellite system went down, we'd still have an internet in our town or among these towns. I'll bet there are a bunch of high school kids out there already who know how to do that.
The metaphor or the comparable is, of course, something called the microgrid, which you may be familiar with. And what that enables us to do is to decentralize some of our energy production and then create an interconnection with the grid, but we connect all of the localities so that if the grid goes down, we still have the resources to generate energy and serve our customers. So we should be thinking this distributed systems. That's what I advocate for in terms of wastewater. You don't want to rely on the central plant going down because then you can't flush your toilets. You want to have something more local, which is fixable, and so on. So I think you have to look at your utilities and say, we want both but we want robust locally. If that addresses the question. Yeah.
And how do you get those incentivized? What you're talking about in terms of the smaller areas.
So how do we counter the agglomeration effect of bigger and bigger, industries, and maybe disseminate some of the production into smaller locales? Quite honestly, I think this administration is really heavily invested in grants to small localities, taking on, I mean, I was just reading about a place in, I think, Kentucky, where they're installing a major solar panel factory, and they're using that as a kind of startup for other incubation of other electrical businesses. So I think, that is pointing towards a trend that some politicians and planners are saying we need to be rethinking the bigger is better. And we need to spread the wealth and the resource and the employment to these areas. So, Kentucky is a great place. There's even, I was reading about, I don't want to go on too long, but in places where there's been mining, maybe in Nebraska, but certainly in Appalachia, there are minerals in the water that could be collected and extracted, rare earth materials. And that can create like a whole new in-town industry. So they will pop up, I think, again, based on as Dan said, the local assets, the local findings. So that's just one example. Yeah, good question. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
What happens if Donald Trump is elected president? And different institutions, building will own and project which have a philosophy, which is essentially a 1400 game out to provide and a significant part of that essentially says part of the game plan is to ignore something. It doesn't exist. You work in the agenda of 1954 instead of 2020. What do you think we will do to push back against and want people to believe that climate change can be ignored and we can continue serving the public and essentially go back to 1954? What can we do to change the
So the question is, if we have a new Republican administration wedded to a 2025 plan that is anti-climate change, what can we do to help survival? I'm not going to venture a solution to that. I do think that what both Dan and I are stressing in this instance is, again, local agency, taking care of your community, looking at your resources, seeing what's abundant. And that's going to work really well in some small towns in America. I don't know how well it's going to work in big cities in America, which, are continuing to produce carbon emissions ad nauseum. So.
Well, my answer to this is going to be an example of professional detachment. This goes back to the idea that natural selection is a blunt instrument. If in fact all of the scientific projections about climate change are correct, let's say that the great consensus of the scientific community is correct, and we do nothing, We don't change, we continue with business as usual, or even accelerate some ideas that are in some ways would even mitigate some of the activities that we've done to try to help with climate change. Ultimately, that becomes a self-correcting phenomenon. And at that point, our ability to, let's say, save humanity, that our ability to mobilize government agencies to act in a way that's going to result in the preservation of the majority of human beings on this planet diminishes. And that's, as Hillary was saying, that's one of the reasons we've been thinking more and more and more about the importance of local initiatives. You know, I've even sometimes in a kind of a joking way said, you should think of paying federal income tax not as a means of generating income for the government to do something for you, but rather as a bribe to ensure that the federal government leaves you alone. Here, take the taxes, now ignore us. Meanwhile, we're going to do the right thing, and we just don't want you. Don't pay any attention to us. It's okay. Here's your money. Render unto Caesar. You know, never let your morals get in the way of doing the right thing.
We need a little break before Bruce starts.
So we're going to stop now. Thanks very much for everybody's comments. Some comments were coming in from Walter down in Brazil, other places throughout the world. And we will stop now for about 10 minutes, and then Bruce Johnson will then pick up afterwards. And thanks very much for Hillary. Oh, not here yet. Should be here, but, yeah. We were supposed to have coffee, but I think it might show up at 11. I'm not sure. So one of the things that might happen is that this is an active museum, and people come into the museum, and it does get a little bit loud, but we just have to go with the flow. How's it working? I don't know why I couldn't get that thing to work last time. Zoom. So it's
Never there. Tinker with it constantly.
Yeah.
It behaves differently
every single time.
every single. Sometimes the share disappears or the chocolate disappears.
Yes.
And it puts it in here into the two dots. And then he takes it out from the two dots and puts it back there.
Yeah, I don't understand it. All right, we have our next speaker.
The coffee addicts are going for the last little bits of caffeine there with
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't go down in here right now. Soft.
Yeah.
On a chair. This happened, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, one more.
Oh, okay.
One more minute. Or
So isn't it interesting to hear the noise of young people discovering, you know?
This is a really dynamic museum. It's an amazing place. And so we're lucky to be here, but if the kids start coming in by the droves when we're speaking, we just have to really talk like we're talking to freshmen. So, all right, Bruce Johnson will talk now about the Nebraska Elder Climate Legacy Initiative, which is a very important part of our Nebraska future. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Scott. I'll try to talk loud enough to keep with the competition. I really think that this 3-day symposium has genuine components of brilliance, you know, and to think of who is being honored. Mary Lou Pritchard, in the write-up, it talks about her legacy. Her feet firmly planted in the ground, her heart rooted in her beloved state of Nebraska, and her eyes on the future. And this whole 3-day symposium, I think, has been around that. And now, in her spirit, and believe me, it sounds like she's just as much looking ahead as ever at 100 years of age, would also be looking ahead and thinking, what does this mean? What could we be addressing? So that's kind of where we're at. And to give you a quick overview of a group that we call ourselves the Nebraska Climate Elders Initiative, that about 10 years ago said, you know, we're retired. We don't have as much responsibility every day of the week. And we have some concerns here. So we went on the internet to see if we could join a group. At that time, there were very few groups around. In fact, we did find some, but they were basically going into DC because they lived in Boston and would be, you know, advocating for a certain policy and so forth. So this is how we really got started. Now, since Bill McGinnis and basically the third act, that has like 70,000 people signed up in that, people 55 and older. Well, here we are as an Elder Climate Legacy Initiative, small but mighty in Nebraska. And just to kind of give you an idea of this, why climate? Well, I think well covered so well, in fact, this morning from Daniel and Hillary. It's the overarching challenge. It's everywhere and it's coming on. It's often referred to as the existential threat on Earth. U.S. military will talk about it as the threat multiplier. Just about to anything that we would see as humans as being a threat. No one is spared, although it probably we see it mostly affecting humanity's poorest or least more resilient. But nevertheless, it's everywhere. And urgency, maybe 10 years, is so much required. So with that, why all this? Well, CO2 levels, and I put this on because I think it's the context of something here. For 800,000 years, by scientific measure, there was never a CO2 level of much, even exceeding 300 parts per million. Well, as this goes off the chart, as of May, we are at 427 parts per million. And the idea of this is that where has this occurred? Well, look at this thing from 1960, which again, some of us are much older than that, but it's basically lifetimes represented here. It was just under about 280 parts per million, and it quickly went into 300 parts per million. So a huge amount of this increase from pre-industrial levels has happened in our lifetimes when it's been on our charge. That should generate some concern and some desire to say, let's do something. So there's where climate change comes into it, correspondingly to global temps steadily rising. Last 10 years, most warmest years on record. 2023, warmest since record keeping began, 1880, NASA. 2 degrees rise in Celsius in pre-industrial levels, critical threshold. Well, we are really moving very fast in that regard. Just in the last 12 months, we were averaging, the Earth exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius and increasing with each year. And yeah, the folks that came for this symposium from out of town, we gave you a little flavor of it Monday, but it's cooled off since. But heat and temperature certainly off the charts. As we look at one of these maps, and I appreciate Hillary's maps, very interesting. But here's our changing climate. And when we think about it, Nebraska represents a transitional area of the country in many ways. And, you know, we're kind of semi-humid to the east. And the difference between, you know, eastern Nebraska and Raleigh, North Carolina, or Ashcroft, North Carolina, not that much different. 30-inch rainfall, etc. Then you get beyond Grand Island and the 100th meridian, and that begins to be looking semi-arid. So here we are, a transitional state. And the 40-mile shift has happened as of recent years. Nebraska is known for its U.S. drought monitor. It was originated, developed, and has continued to be maintained as a U.S. drought monitor, and also basically global with that. And what we're seeing with not just temperature, but the frequency and the intensity of extreme events, okay? And when they happen, okay, we get our annual rainfall. Well, that's good. No, it's not. It's really the adverse effect of that. And good measures would suggest that as we're looking at the middle of the country, we are beginning to see more and more days per year where we have Oklahoma type temperature. Okay, a little better. Okay. And so, you know, again, do we want to put up with 60 days of 100-degree plus, or 30 or 15? That is moving farther and farther north across the plains. So, you know, originally, those who came to survey the country before it was even a country saw Nebraska's areas being the Great American Desert. And we may be seeing that. You know, changing climate, extreme patterns, as we said. This is Rock Valley, Iowa, June 22nd of this year. That's not a very good situation. 15-inch rainfalls in very, very short period of time. Unable to really handle that. South Lincoln, this is the Salt Creek levee on, what was it? 6th of May, 2015. And there was another event very much like that shortly followed. The damage that can happen to this, tipping those levees, very, very worrisome. And we were right at the top before we did have a break, and it got through the city of Lincoln. This was a story of northeast Nebraska, Boyd County, a 100-year-old dam that was a hydro plant, wiped out by the amazing epic storm, which was really a pre-thaw of the soils, and so much loss with big rainfall and ice, and wiped out that dam. So anyway, we get that out of the way before I step on it. Along with this comes water loss and damage to agricultural lands, very, very severe. And Franklin Roosevelt had it right. A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. That's what we're up against. So the point, we must move from inaction to action, adapt to changes, occurrences today and in the coming years. reduce as much of the warming as possible with a wide range of mitigation. Okay, am I staying over them a little bit or not? Higher, okay. Well, what about elders? Where's that word come into it? Well, we like to say seniors leave footprints, but elders leave a legacy, okay? And certainly Mary Lou Pritchard is one of those elders to admire. Why people are denying or just not really getting too serious about our climate. And denial is one of this. In fact, I would say these are the, it's a group. These what I would call the dastardly D's, okay? You know, from melodrama years, the dastardly villain. Well, denial is one of them. Some people are just saying, I don't see it as a threat. I'm sorry. Defeated. That's another bad D. What can I do? I can't do anything. It's beyond me. Distracted. My family, 40-year-olds and up, they're too busy figuring out where to run the next kid, you know, to soccer practice and that sort of thing. Dismissive. Daniel mentioned that. We can rely on technology in the future. They'll figure it out. That's bad too. I'd say dumb down is pretty important too. Dumb down in terms of all of us to think short run and take me and mine, okay? And with it comes a bad politic. Let's just say it that way. We should be civilized and informed for sure. So elders think a little differently, okay? Elders will say, hey, I'm concerned. Nature is acting weird, and I don't care what my political persuasion is. It's bothersome. I can remember when it was this way and it was better or whatever. My life's experiences could weave into some wisdom. And here again, I refer to a kind of a dumb insurance commercial for Farmers Insurance. The old bald guy in a brown suit going saying, hey, we've seen a thing or two, so we know a thing or two. Well, that's a good one-liner phrase, I think. We have some experience by our age. And I don't care if you're 30-something in this group, you have experience to draw from too, you know? I do care about my children and grandchildren. If there's any place where we could get on both sides of the political aisle, that's that. Can we not agree we'd like to leave a good future for our own immediate family and their generation, okay? I increasingly appreciate community. And here again, when we get together and work on something together, we energize, we encourage, we lift up one another and things happen. Grassroots, what we heard earlier this morning, okay? Legacy means giving something to another person, a legacy that I gift. And that doesn't mean necessarily financial dollars. So that's why we talk about mobilizing wisdom, talents, experience, resources to influence, promote actions for a more, maybe I'm going to change this from sustainable to a more resilient environment for current and future generations. Be a catalyst for meaningful change. And that's a role for each and every one of us. So our goal, these are 4 goals that we are working on. We have since we begun about 7, 8 years ago. Work towards a statewide action, funding it, developing it, and implementing a comprehensive climate action plan for this state. Thinking a geographic area, maybe to be able to have a context of space for sure. Goal 2, provide awareness, knowledge, education on workable solutions. We really believe in seeing the positive can-do side of it. And so in all kinds of fronts, even being part of this great symposium, you know. Goal 3, we're an ag state, second to none. and to support regenerative ag and healthy soils as part of that across the whole state. More on that later. Goal 4, we need to promote climate justice. This is not a case of ignoring justice. This makes sense as very much any kind of climate action, if not just for justice for the future. Guidelines, grassroots, multifaceted action, partnering, collaborating, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, embracing diverse contributions. And even as we're talking about that this afternoon, we're dealing with a diversity of people and folk and culture and coming together with a whole variety of passion and interests. We embrace that. Nature does that. Maybe that's why we will see, so many good examples as we look at that. Dynamic, evolving. We never get there, but we're going to be on the track. Processing. Celebrating and building community. We find places to be jubilant about, that we've got to a point. And certainly grounded in persistence and hope, not just, the world's coming to a hell in a handbasket. So these are, and you get on our site, you can see these. We talk about lifestyle. We talk about education, public policy, economic decision-making, individually and corporately, and advocacy. So our legacy, look at lifestyle really, really quick here. Living our personal values each day in simplicity and joy. The idea is to understand that, we should be able to experience this in a holistic way, not just self-serving. Having an attitude of gratitude instead of a presumption of consumption, okay? I think Gandhi was known to have said, live simply that others may simply live. That's a one-liner that we should remember, okay? With that, economic decision-making, factoring economic decisions through the lens of Earth stewardship. It's a fun exercise to go through. Think of all the R words that will show up here. In a circular economy, we had discussion of that already this morning. Certainly reduce, reuse, repair, restore, recycle, regenerate. These are the living, we can, again, understand nature this way of keeping a living process and a thriving process going. And the R's go on and on. But don't forget long-term investment and estate planning as well. Education, lifelong learning. We don't know it all. We've got to be humble, but we can sure keep trying to learn and explore and grow in understanding. There's a process that's almost like a pyramid. We talk about data. Data runs everything. Well, that's one level, but then there's knowledge that comes into the place, which is a little higher level. But even there, it shouldn't stop. It should go to understanding. And at the very top, you have wisdom. It's a fascinating pyramid, but that's the way our human process could really, I think, appreciate and think about more. Certainly for advocacy, younger generations, we do sponsor the annual Youth Summit. And by the way, we are seriously as a group thinking about promoting in the spirit of our young people, particularly, a policy bill to be introduced in the coming legislature of Nebraska, that all Nebraskans would have a right to a more resilient and livable environment, much like Montana has done, and about a half a dozen other states. Let's get it introduced and have a public discussion and discourse about it. Okay? All right. Oh,
It's a little bit too far from there.
okay. Yeah. Is this sound a little better?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. All right. And certainly certainly coalition building, you know, among environmental groups. And we are actually pulling together, our group has even had a couple of sessions already in the process of 8 to 10 key environmental groups in the state of Nebraska, focusing on this state and talking about what we would call the Climate Action Now, the CAN initiative, okay? That's going to resonate because we can do some things much more effectively as coalitions. So, and with that, public policy, you bet. Be a voice of wisdom and civility in the public policy, much as our honored curator from Mary Louise Pritchard. Dan keeps talking about her being so nice, but boy, was she a pistol. Okay. Again, a couple things on that regard, and I sure don't want to cut Chuck short on this. A success story of our group. We formed, we were the background for a soil health task force, and that led to a passage of this state of LB 925, Nebraska's Soil Health and Water Quality Initiative. We'd been trying for years to get a climate action plan passed and laughed out of the legislature and filibustered with hilarity. Like, we don't need that. We know what we're doing. So we came in the back door with a soil health initiative. And it was passed with great bipartisan support. And we are moving ahead with the Nebraska Soil Health Coalition to form 5 to 6 hubs across a very diverse state. Within each of those hubs, we do have producer-led organizations, producer-led learning and research. But also a second part of it is stakeholder engagement of the community, of the producers and non-producers, the residents, and that sort of thing. And what's that going to do? That's going to build up local solutions and build trust. And with that comes demonstration and so forth. And it's a new spin, and we're seeing it being really embraced. Coalition building across. So that's our team. We're small but mighty. We have quite a diversity of people. A number of UNL emeriti so we keep bugging UNL and to kind of stay on track in this regard. And so we get a lot done, but it's a very diverse group and we learn from one another. So that's our story. And thank you for your attention. Bye. Yeah.
So, hi, and I think this is absolutely great. I work very similar in the infection disease community. And what I was thinking here is how can we take taking initiative from the grassroots community? Would you actively reach out to them, to have involvement in not know something, or do you just let them come to you, or working back to the or making it beyond the hubs, right? Or making the hubs bigger, if you will.
We are experimenting here. How do you even get this started in terms of a hub or whatever? And I think you start first with humility and say, you know, we really do have a very serious issue. And can you share how you see it? You seek to understand, and then you basically respond accordingly. And what we find in even in these soil health hubs, we have people saying, yeah, ag does good things, but we have terrible nitrate problems, and that bothers us. And the farmer producer across the table says, yeah, and my kids, I'm worried for my kids too. And you find a common sense of need and perhaps some direction forward. And that's how we're seeing it happen. And let the grassroots begin to embrace solving. Hey, you know, we aren't talking about some outside expert. We do it locally. Now, again, with the question about a change of administration at the federal level, that's scary. That means maybe states need to do more and energize. Well, yeah, okay, we will move forward on this front and that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. The question, how do you overcome political dysfunction? Is that a nice way of saying it? It's a whole bunch of crap. But anyway, you know, again, I think there's enough folks that say, you know, there's a little more sense here. In fact, it's in our DNA, I think, in Nebraska. We had Williams Jennings Bryan here, of all things. And we also had George Norris, the founder of Rural Electric Association, the REA. These are the kinds of examples that we have as Nebraskans, I think, to say, well, we may disagree on a lot of the specifics of politics, but let's think about the policy long-term that's best for all of us. That's what I would hope we do. Gradually, we work at it. And we also then, when we say vote with climate in mind, we ask every candidate that's looking for an elected position, say, how do you see the climate situation? And what do you embrace as far as action? We need to be holding our elected officials accountable. So. All right. Oh, that's yours. Okay.
So I don't think we need to have this thing going. Let me get things readjusted here. Do you need more space? Is this okay if I lay this down? Okay, like that? Yeah. Okay, so we are going to now switch over and we'll have additional speaker. And I'll let you introduce yourself because I don't have anything prepared for you. So I'll let you do it. So you're gonna have to speak into this and that simultaneously to override all those kids out there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Let me say up front that I do have a soft voice, so it will be I've actually written louder on every page of my notes, but it would be helpful if you would put your hand up to your ear if you can't hear me. To keep reminding me because I tend to forget to speak louder. So my name is Chuck Hasselbrook. I work in renewable energy development, although I'm not speaking for my employer today. I also do some work on climate-related work on advocacy, where we're working in Washington to gain greater research and support for development of a biochar industry that can sequester carbon improve soil health, and have multiple benefits. My comments will focus on steps that rural community leaders and policymakers can take to realize the potential opportunities that may come about from climate change. The key word in that is opportunity, in that to be realized, it has to be seized. We have to act upon it. There's nothing just going to happen. We have to make it happen. And when it comes to building a future in rural communities, it starts with rural people deciding that it's worth investing their time and their resources in creating a future in their community. And also with policymakers deciding that our rural communities are worth investing public resources in. You know, I spent 36 years with the Center for Rural Affairs, and during those years, I sometimes heard the argument that, you know, we have a lot more communities out there than we need. And what we need to do is we need to reject emotional appeals to save them and let most of them die. And I've heard that from economists. I even heard it from some of my rural neighbors, although in much less academic terms. But I have to say that I strongly disagree. I think the bonds that we form with people and a place over time have value, that they add richness to life, and that living in community, no matter where it's at, whether it's city or a rural area, but living in a rural community, I think brings the better out in us. I mean, I'm not naive. There are no community utopias out there. But when people live in community, where they know that they're around neighbors who they're going to see year in and year out, who will hold them accountable and remember their behavior, they tend to be more willing to help each other and less likely to act in the most selfish ways. You know, I've lived it. I've experienced in rural Nebraska. It enriched my life. It has real value. And I will tell you, I especially felt it when tragedy befell my family. And there's strong evidence that most rural people agree. At the Center for Rural Affairs, when I was there, we did a poll. It's kind of a national poll, but in selected states of rural people, to look at their attitudes about the future of their communities, about public policy related to rural communities. And the one measure that drew the strongest agreement across all states among rural people was the statement that the small town and rural way of life is worth maintaining. And so community is worth something, and we ought not just throw it away. And that's why we need to work at building a future in communities. So what are the keys to seizing the opportunities that climate change may create? I would say that for the most part, the requisite steps are steps that we would take anyway to create a future in our communities. So it's not that different from what I would say rural communities need to do generally, but you especially need to do it if you want to tap any opportunities that might be created by climate change. First is that you have to have communities with a core of leaders who come together to develop a strategy and a plan to create a future in their community that brings the rest of the community along, that has support generally within the community. It's never 100%. There's always naysayers. But for communities to thrive, there must be a commitment to building communities in a way that builds the support of the broader community. And that takes effective leadership. So I think communities need to be intentional about supporting and encouraging their leaders, and also about developing leaders. And one thing communities can do is take advantage of really kind of a myriad of programs today out there to help build leadership skills, to train people to become more effective leaders. Those are really important to communities. You know, the most successful communities are willing to invest their own resources in building their community. That's a key factor. You know, the Nebraska Community Foundation has done a great job over the years. Maxine Miles here, the original creator. Chuck Hibbard, the board chair, is here. But they've done a wonderful job of inspiring community members to contribute money to invest in their community. And that money is critical to community development. But I have to say, it's not just the money. also critical is the commitment that that investment reflects. Because when people invest in a strategy, they have ownership in it. And when people invest in a strategy, they're committed to making it work. And I worked a lot to get grants from outside sources, to build public policies that create grants for rural community development. But I will tell you that grants from outside sources can be very helpful, but they're much more effective if those grants are leveraged by local resources and local community commitment. Thriving communities invest in their quality of life, and that's especially critical in the age of the internet, when for some of us at least, or a significant number of us, we're not so tied to living in a particular place to hold the job that we have. And we're not even as tied as we used to be to a particular place to get access to the entertainment we might want. And that means that people are more free to live where they want to live. And that means that it's essential for communities to think very strategically about their quality of life and how they build it. So investing in quality of life can take a lot of forms. Could be investing in a swimming pool for kids. Might be a tennis court or a racquetball court for adults. Youth sport leagues, local farmers markets, community centers, libraries that connect people on the internet, and other initiatives. One of the things I think about when I think about quality of life is how do we make rural communities interesting? Because I think people, at least I think many of us, we're naturally drawn to communities we find interesting. So for me, I'm kind of a history buff. And one of the things that I find interesting in communities is that communities that respect their history, that invest in historic preservation. To me, that makes a community more interesting. There's things like that communities can do. I think that one of the great untapped assets we have in rural Nebraska is the asset of access to nature. You know, one of my former colleagues, when I was at the Center for Rural Affairs, grew up in Europe. And he made the comment that when he lived in rural Nebraska, he was surrounded by vast amounts of land, but he had less access to land in rural Nebraska than he had in the densely populated European metropolitan area they grew up in, because they had public spaces. So I think that one of the things we can do to make our communities more interesting and attractive is to provide access to that nature. Nature trails, opportunities to hunt and fish, access to streams for canoeing and kayaking, all those things create recreational opportunities and they improve quality of life. You know, when I lived in Lyons, I was really struck by the natural beauty of some of the areas down along Logan Creek. It was a creek that was dredged over 100 years ago, but they cut off a lot of the old oxbows. And those areas down in that valley are wooded, there's ponds in them, and they're really quite beautiful. And just because I knew the landowners, I was able to get access to them. But imagine if you created trails that provided public access to them, that would be, I think, a real asset for that community. But I think that's an untapped opportunity. However, I will say the Les Hills Resource Conservation Development District recently has been working to create places to put kayaks in and take them out of the Logan Creek. Now, nobody's going to say the Logan Creek is the Niagara River, but I've spent time along that creek, and it's a really nice place to be. And so providing access to those things, I think, has real value. I won't say a lot about this, but quality housing stock is a key component of quality of life. People live, stay in, or move to places that have the kind of housing they like at a price they can afford. So affordable housing, particularly for working people, is a real challenge that we need to address. And one last thing about quality of life is that a welcoming community draws people. People want to live where they feel wanted, accepted, and engaged. And communities that provide that will have a leg up. You know, I've moved to places where people knocked on my door, introduced themselves, welcomed me. And I have to tell you, that means something. And when they give you chances to engage with them, those are all the kinds of things that make communities stronger, that make the people that live there now feel a bigger stake in the community, and they make more people want to move there. And I think we need to be very intentional about being welcoming places as part of our community development strategy. Finally, to draw and retain people, communities need strong economies. Just a second. I'm gonna put these over here so I don't fall down. Fell down anyway. Okay. We need strong economies. And I'm convinced that the greatest opportunities in rural Nebraska are tied to entrepreneurship. People creating their own opportunities by starting businesses, maybe for self-employment or maybe employing several people. And there are valuable resources available to rural communities to support entrepreneurship. The REAP program at the Center for Rural Affairs provides loans, training, technical assistance to people, small micro entrepreneurs, few employees or self-employment oriented venture. I can speak historically about the REAP program, but even though it provided loans only to people who couldn't get lending, couldn't get credit from a bank, their delinquency and loan loss rates were very comparable to private lenders. And the reason was that they invested in business training and technical assistance. And good training on how to develop an effective business plan and manage a business can go a long way in improving the success likelihood of a business. So, there's a lot that can be done there. A number of organizations in rural Nebraska have also provided training for youth entrepreneurship to give young people the skills to create their own job in rural Nebraska. In addition to giving young people the skills to be entrepreneurial, to start a business in rural Nebraska, I think it also has the benefit giving them a visible, discernible pathway that they can take to creating a future for themselves and their community. And that's important. Rural schools have integrated entrepreneurship training in their curriculum. In the community of Cody, some time ago, it was probably 15 years ago, maybe longer, their high school students in an entrepreneurship course started a local grocery store because Cody didn't have a grocery store. It was a town of 167 people in the Sandhills. And Cody's kind of a showcase for entrepreneurship. In addition to the local grocery store, they have a business, George Paul Vinegarery, that produces high quality culinary vinegars that they sell to the finest restaurants, not just in Omaha and Lincoln, but in New York and on both the coasts. They have Sandhills Boot Company, Kyle Rosfeld. He handcrafts these beautiful boots that he sells at a premium price. Willie Nelson had a pair. But those are examples of what a community can do by supporting entrepreneurship. Many rural people have an entrepreneurial bent, including many of the recent immigrants to arrive in Nebraska, and we need to support and cultivate that entrepreneurial spirit. We also need to build supported public policy for rural entrepreneurship. That was much of my focus at the Center for Rural Affairs. We conceived and won passage of legislation in Congress and the state legislature to create rural development programs to support rural development initiatives. I talked about the REAP program and why it could make loans to people who couldn't get bank loans and make it work with technical assistance and training. They could do that because there are programs out there that make grants to programs to do that. And that's why public policy is important. We passed a program to fund programs, not just the REAP program, but programs all over America. We passed a state micro-entrepreneur tax credit to give a little tax break for people starting their own small business. And we created a tax credit for landowners who rent land to beginning farmers. We won passage of state and federal programs to make grants to help launch value-added businesses. For example, Burback Country Dairy at Hardington. They started a milk bottling operation to bottle the milk they produced on their own farm. They're selling it in grocery stores around Northeast Nebraska at least. It was started with the assistance of the Nebraska Value-Added Agriculture Grant, a program that was created by the legislature to support value-added agriculture in rural Nebraska. Building supported policy can really facilitate local initiatives to build a community, build a strong rural economy. It doesn't take the place of local initiative, but it certainly supports and facilitates local initiative. The ethanol industry has provided new opportunities across rural Nebraska, and I believe there are evolving opportunities there. You know, electric vehicles are going to take some of the existing market for ethanol, but there's a much bigger evolving market for sustainable, low carbon, sustainable aviation fuel and low carbon bunker fuels for ocean going vessels. But the key will be lowering the carbon intensity of fuels. I think there are new opportunities for some new approaches to producing, additional approaches to producing biofuels, from low carbon cellulosic biomass, corn stover, grass crops, invasive red cedar, from which you can produce fuels as well as biochar for application to soil. They're created by the process of pyrolysis, heating biomass in the absence of oxygen. The biochar co-produced with the fuel is a form of charcoal designed for use in soil. It improves soil health and it sequesters carbon for hundreds of thousands of years. And it has a real advantage over some of the other so-called natural strategies for sequestering carbon, like planting trees or perhaps planting cover crops. And the advantage here is that those are good practices, don't get me wrong, but you can plant cover crops every year, but if they change practices, you're going to lose the benefits you created. And you can plant trees, but if you have a forest fire, you lose the benefits you created. One thing about biochar is if you put it in soil, it's going to be there for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's not going to be affected by changing practices. And it's not an exotic substance. I mean, the biochar from prairie fires is a major part of the soil organic matter in our soils in Nebraska. In fact, some estimates say that about half the organic matter in Great Plains soils comes from biochar from prairie fires. So it's a real strategy for both building soil health and sequestering carbon. You know, you may have heard about some of the large companies that buy carbon removal credits from these what's called direct air capture machines that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And some companies have paid $600 a ton for them to do carbon removal to offset some of their emissions. Well, I have to tell you, in the carbon removal market, biochar accounts for 90% of the carbon removal credits. And they're paying $150 a ton of CO2 to do it. So it's a very practical method for removing and sequestering carbon. I think the state of Nebraska needs to have a strategy to position itself in the future of biofuels and things like biochar, a strategy for getting there for low carbon fuels, including a strategy for how we develop next generation fuels from biomass. I'll say a little bit. There are also, I think, real opportunities in rural energy, renewable energy development for communities to take advantage of it. It's unfortunate that renewable energy has become so politicized, but there are benefits there for communities that take advantage of it. Renewable energy facilities can create a lot of local tax revenue to support schools, to support community institutions. They can create some good jobs. They can create some income from landowners. So there's an enormous opportunity. We're going to see a big expansion in solar in Nebraska over the next 5 to 10 years. Some of it because we have new businesses in the state that are demanding that their electricity be green electricity. In the long term, there are going to be even bigger opportunities. I anticipate that for a lot of good reasons, we're going to build large transmission lines that link different regions of the country because it provides much more reliability for the grid if we can connect the country together effectively. There's a new line going in from Dodge City, Kansas to Indiana that would ultimately deliver power from Dodge City to the mid-Atlantic seaboard. And I'm developing a solar project down there. And you know, one of the interesting things about being able to move electricity interregionally, peak electric demand is in the evening. And a lot of times the years after the sun goes down. The sun goes down an hour and a half later in Dodge City, Kansas than it does in Baltimore. And that's a real advantage. And so The other advantage is that sometimes when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing in one region, it's not in the other. And if you can move it around, you just have a much more reliable grid. And so there's opportunities there. We need to take advantage of them. We need to do renewable energy development responsibly. I think that means being good neighbors, it means having setbacks and residences and things like that. I think we also need to be attuned to concerns about losing farmland or converting farmland over to solar projects. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to address those concerns. There's a growing interest in agri-solar, where land is simultaneously used for solar generation and agriculture. One of the most proven strategies at this point is sheep production, because sheep are small enough that they don't wreck everything. You know, there might also be opportunities for calves. I mean, you wouldn't put cows in there because they would wreck them. I think there'll be opportunities potentially for low stature crops. I read about a solar farm going in Ohio that was planting soybeans and wheat between the rows. You wouldn't want to have 10 feet corn in there because it would shade the panels. And it's really very expensive to raise the panels really high. So you have to figure out a way to do things where you have, you know, normal height panels. But there's some real opportunities there that we need to pay attention to and take advantage of to address the concerns about renewable energy. With that, I'll close. I just want to say there are opportunities out there for rural communities, including opportunities related to climate change. But as always, it will be up to rural people and to policymakers representing rural areas to seize those opportunities through local community initiative and supported public policy. Thank you. Yeah.
So, being from a rural area originally, one of the things that I felt was kind of distinct about it was there was this constant kind of hanging cloud of this low grade kind of despair that came from feeling like your community was dying. That folks had to first go to the grocery store, then go to the library, and now switching from 500 people at the turn of the 20th century to maybe 50 people now. And my private suspicion is that some of the kind of cultural, political people in rural areas really kind of both into their own self-interest sometimes and support things that are against their own self-interest. It kind of comes from a place of hopelessness, and most just all lots anyway. So my question is, someone with so much experience working with rural communities and studying these things from both kind of like an academic perspective and a business perspective and a personal perspective, how do you think hope in terms of, hey, these rural revitalization is a viable strategy, this town can go back to 500 people and have its own high school again, have its own economy again. How do you think hope would, that kind of hope would change the formula?
Well, it certainly changes the rural community when there's hope. And it's part of what leaders do is they create hope. They create hope around a vision. And so I think that does create a different mentality in the community. I think there are examples out there. You guys mentioned Ord earlier. He's done a great job of community development. There are lots of other communities around the state that have done that. And I mean, again, local leaders need to be there to hold things up, hold up examples, to provide a pathway and give hope and give a path to get there, I think. Yeah.
Chuck, maybe to add to that, Rescue Community Foundation, we know hope is one of the major drivers of success in the community, but we add the word active in front of hope. Because if people are willing to dig in and do some things, they're going to make a difference. And so hope as a word by itself may not be very inspiring, but active hope seems to get people's attention and kind of changes mindset a little bit in terms of